Dear listeners, I ask you to listen to the story until the very end and be sure to write a review about what you liked and what needs to be changed to make it more interesting for you to listen to my stories. Tears over Normandy. The night smelled of damp earth and gunpowder, a thick haze settling over the battered French countryside like a ghostly shroud. The sky, once an endless stretch of ink-black void, was now torn apart by distant explosions, each burst of fire revealing fleeting glimpses of the storm-torn clouds above. Frank Jefferson lay pressed against the uneven ground, feeling the weight of the damp uniform clinging to his skin, his breath shallow and controlled. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, a strange, out-of-place sound amidst the distant cries of wounded men and mechanical growl of enemy vehicles. He had landed wrong. His left knee throbbed, a sharp, biting pain spreading up his leg like wildfire. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the silence that followed the chaos. The drop had gone to hell. The moment his boots left the belly of the plane, the sky had erupted in a symphony of flak and tracer rounds, their bright arcs slicing through the air like the talons of some ancient predator. He had glimpsed the others, shadowy figures with parachutes billowing behind them, before the night swallowed them whole. Now the ground beneath him felt too solid, too real. His fingers dug into the dirt as he tried to gather his bearings. His rifle, his lifeline, was still strapped to his chest, but where the hell was Charlie? The thought hit him like a gut punch. They had jumped together, side by side, like they always had. He had seen Charlie's chute deploy, seen him drifting downward, his silhouette cutting through the night like a phantom. But now nothing. Frank forced himself up, his breath hitching as his knee protested. The hedgerows loomed ahead, dark and menacing, their jagged branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. He had to move. The others would be regrouping, trying to make sense of this godforsaken mess. Then he heard it. A sound so small, so insignificant amid the roar of war, that it almost didn't register. A soft, gurgling noise, like water slipping over stones. But Frank knew better. He had heard it before, too many times. The sound of a man trying to breathe through blood-filled lungs. His heart pounded as he moved toward the noise, his boots sinking into the damp earth. And then, beneath the twisted wreckage of a broken tree, he saw him. Charlie. His uniform was soaked, but not with rain. His helmet lay discarded, revealing a mess of dark matted hair clinging to his forehead. His eyes, those damn blue eyes that had always been filled with mischief, were wide, darting, searching. Frank dropped to his knees, his hands moving without thinking, pressing against the wound in Charlie's abdomen. Too much blood. Frank had seen men die before. In training, they had talked about it like it was just another part of the job, something you had to accept. But it was different when it was Charlie. They had met in boot camp, had laughed through the misery, had dreamed of the day they would go home and sit on Charlie's porch in Kentucky, drinking whiskey and telling stories that would make their grandkids blush. Charlie's lips moved, but no sound came. Frank leaned in. Didn't see it. Charlie's hand gripped his wrist, weak but desperate. Frank swallowed the lump in his throat. Save your strength, buddy. You're gonna be fine, he lied. But Charlie wasn't stupid. His grip tightened for the briefest moment before going slack. His breath hitched, then slowed. Then nothing. Frank didn't move, didn't breathe. Somewhere, in the distance, the war raged on. But here, in the mud and the blood and the shattered remains of a broken tree, time had stopped. Charlie was gone, and Frank Jefferson had never felt so alone. Frank didn't know how long he sat there, his knees sinking into the wet ground, his hands still pressing against a body that no longer had any warmth left to give. Time had lost all meaning. The war was still there. He could hear it, feel it in the distant vibrations of artillery shaking the ground beneath him. But it felt. His world, the only one that mattered, had just been ripped apart and left to rot beneath the shattered limbs of a dying tree. The blood that soaked into his uniform, mixing with the mud, wasn't just another stain to be scrubbed out later. It was Charlie. Charlie, who had laughed too loud at bad jokes, who had stolen extra rations when no one was looking, who had sworn up and down that he would make it home to see the sun set over the rolling hills of Kentucky. Charlie, who was now nothing more than another lifeless body on a battlefield that didn't care. Frank's throat was dry, his pulse hammering in his ears as he slowly pulled his shaking hand away. The warmth was already fading, leaving behind only the sticky, metallic reminder of just how fragile a human life could be. He wanted to scream, wanted to punch the earth until his fists bled, but there was no time for that. The world wouldn't stop just because he wanted it to. His head snapped up at the sound of voices, low, urgent, and too close. Germans. He hadn't even realized how exposed he was, crouched there in the open, a perfect target for any enemy soldier who happened to glance his way. His breath caught as he scanned the darkness, his muscles stiff from too many minutes spent kneeling in place. He had to move, had to get out before they found him, before Charlie's body became nothing more than another corpse they looted for rations and ammunition. Crawling backward, he forced himself into the tangled mass of the hedgerow, ignoring the sharp twigs that tore at his uniform, snagging the fabric like desperate hands trying to hold him back. He wanted to stay, wanted to bury Charlie, give him something, anything, other than this lonely, miserable death. But the war had no patience for grief. He had to push it down, swallow it whole, and keep going. That's what Charlie would have done. His fingers tightened around the cold steel of his rifle, the weight of it grounding him as he crept forward, each movement slow and deliberate. The voices were getting closer now, their harsh syllables cutting through the night like jagged glass. He could see them through the gaps in the leaves, 3 figures moving cautiously, their weapons raised, eyes sweeping the area like wolves hunting for wounded prey. Frank's pulse pounded in his ears as he pressed himself lower, his heartbeat a frantic rhythm against the damp earth. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and too damn tired to think straight. He should have been afraid, maybe he was, but all he could feel was anger. A deep, seething rage that burned hotter than the pain in his knee or the cold seeping into his bones. These men, these uniformed bastards, were the reason Charlie was dead. They were the reason he was alone, crawling through the mud like a goddamn rat. The Germans stopped a few yards away, their voices hushed, their movements tense. They had seen something, maybe footprints, maybe a broken branch, maybe just a shadow shifting in the wind, but they knew someone was there. Frank adjusted his grip on his rifle, his breath coming slow and steady now. He had the element of surprise. That was something. Maybe not much, but it was enough. He counted their steps. 1, 2, 3. Then he moved. He barely registered the recoil as he squeezed the trigger, the crack of gunfire splitting the night apart. The first soldier jerked backward, his body hitting the ground with a dull thud. The second spun, shouting something in German, but Frank was already shifting, already firing again, the muzzle flash painting the hedgerow in brief, violent bursts of light. The third soldier dove for cover, shouting frantically as he scrambled behind a fallen log. Frank could hear the rasp of his breath, the clatter of his rifle as he fumbled to return fire. But Frank was faster. He pushed forward, ignoring the sharp pain in his knee, his fingers moving on instinct as he pulled the trigger again. Another shot, another body hitting the dirt. Then silence. Frank stayed low, his chest heaving, his grip tight on his weapon as he listened. No more voices, no more footsteps, just the wind and the distant echoes of gunfire miles away. He didn't move right away. He couldn't. His body was still wired, still caught in that space between survival and exhaustion. But the adrenaline was fading, leaving behind nothing but the dull, aching weight of reality pressing down on him like a lead blanket. He was alone. Again. For a moment, he let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, the worst was over. That he could find his unit, regroup, and push forward like they had trained to do. But then he heard it, a low, wet cough. Not German. American. His stomach twisted as he turned toward the sound, his fingers already gripping his rifle tighter. He knew before he even saw the figure slumped against the tree that it wasn't Charlie. Charlie was dead, but that didn't make the sight any easier. The soldier was young, too young, his uniform dark with blood, his helmet missing. His eyes flickered up as Frank approached, wide with pain and something else relief. Frank dropped to his knees, his hands already moving to assess the wound. The kid flinched but didn't push him away. He didn't have the strength. "Hang on," Frank muttered, barely aware of the words leaving his mouth. "You're gonna be okay." The lie tasted like ash, because they both knew the truth. The truth was sprawled out in front of him, written in the blood soaking through the soldier's jacket, seeping into the damp earth beneath them. It was in the way his hands trembled as he tried to hold on to something, anything, but there was nothing left to grasp. It was in his breathing, sharp and uneven, a ragged sound that cut through the silence like a dull knife. Frank had seen wounds like this before. Hell, he'd seen men with wounds half as bad bleed out in minutes. The kid didn't have long, and they both knew it. Frank swallowed hard, forcing down the lump in his throat as he pressed his hand against the wound, trying to stem the bleeding even though it was useless. The kid winced, his body tensing, but he didn't scream. Maybe he didn't have the strength. Maybe he just didn't see the point anymore. His lips moved, forming words that barely made it past the blood pooling in his mouth. Frank leaned in, straining to hear, but the words were soft, barely more than a breath. It didn't matter. He already knew what the kid was asking. Where are they? Frank had seen it 100 times before. That desperate, searching look in their eyes, the way they scanned the darkness like they expected their squad to come running, like they couldn't believe they'd been left behind. But Frank knew better. There was no one coming. If there was, they'd already be here. This kid, whoever he was, had been alone for a long time before Frank had found him. The kid's breathing hitched, his body shuddering beneath Frank's hands. Frank knew he should say something, anything, but what the hell was there to say? That it was going to be okay. That help was on the way. That he wasn't dying alone in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by bodies that would be forgotten by morning. It would all be a lie. So Frank didn't say a damn thing. He just stayed there, kneeling in the mud, his hands pressed against a wound that wasn't going to stop bleeding, watching as the light in the kid's eyes slowly dimmed. It didn't take long. A few more breaths. A few more heartbeats. Then nothing. Just an empty stare, locked on a sky that didn't care. Frank sat back, his arms heavy, his fingers sticky with blood that wasn't his. He wanted to feel something, grief, anger, anything, but there was nothing left. He was too damn tired. Too numb. He reached out, gently closing the kid's eyes before pushing himself to his feet, his muscles protesting every movement. His uniform was soaked, his body aching, but none of it mattered. The night was still alive with the sounds of war, and he couldn't afford to sit here any longer. He took one last look at the kid, committing his face to memory, even though he knew it wouldn't last. They never did. The faces always blurred together in the end, lost in a haze of smoke and gunfire and blood. Frank turned away, his rifle heavy in his hands as he moved forward, deeper into the darkness. He didn't know where he was going. He didn't know if he'd make it through the night. But he kept walking, because that was the only choice he had left. The ground beneath his boots was slick with rain and blood, a treacherous mixture that threatened to pull him down with every step, but he didn't slow. There was no time to be careful, no time to think about what had just happened. If he stopped, if he let himself linger in that moment for even a second longer, he wasn't sure he'd be able to start again. He moved through the hedgerows like a shadow, his body pressed low, his rifle clutched tight against his chest. Every rustle of leaves, every distant crack of gunfire sent his heart into his throat. But he kept moving, his instincts guiding him more than any conscious thought. He needed to find his unit, needed to get back to someone, anyone, who could tell him what the hell was going on. But in the darkness, with nothing but the occasional glow of distant flares to light his way, the French countryside felt like an endless maze of death and silence. The night air was thick with smoke, the acrid stench of burning wood and flesh clinging to the back of his throat. Somewhere in the distance, a dog was barking, a hollow, frantic sound that didn't belong in a place like this. It reminded him of home, of summer nights on the outskirts of Chicago when he was just a kid, lying awake in bed while the neighbors' mutt howled at the moon. That had been another lifetime, a different world entirely, one that had nothing to do with the man he was now, the man slogging through the mud with blood on his hands and death in his wake. A flicker of movement caught his eye up ahead, and Frank dropped to a crouch, his finger hovering over the trigger as he peered through the tangled branches. He didn't breathe, didn't blink, his entire body wound so tight he thought he might snap. There, just beyond the tree line, figures moving in the dark. Not many. 2, maybe 3. He strained his ears, trying to pick up anything, voices, the jangle of gear, the unmistakable cadence of German or English, but the wind was against him, carrying the sound away before they could reach him. He could wait, try to get closer, figure out who they were. But waiting meant risk. Waiting meant giving up the advantage of surprise. And Frank had already learned the hard way what happened when you hesitated. His grip tightened on his rifle, his breath slow and measured as he pressed himself against the damp earth, inching forward one agonizing movement at a time. The figures ahead hadn't seen him yet, their movements cautious but unhurried. If they were Germans, they weren't expecting trouble. If they were Americans, they were just as lost as he was. Then a voice. low, muffled, but unmistakably English. Frank's heart slammed against his ribs as relief crashed over him like a wave, so sudden and intense it nearly knocked him flat. He didn't think, didn't have time to. Before he was pushing himself up, stepping forward, his rifle lowered just enough to show he wasn't a threat. "Hey." His voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper, but it was enough. The figure spun toward him, weapons raised, eyes wide with alarm. For a moment, no one moved. Then one of them stepped forward, the dim light catching the edge of his uniform, the unmistakable patch of the 101st glinting against his sleeve. "Jesus Christ," the man exhaled, his rifle lowering as recognition flickered across his face. "We thought you were dead." Frank let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his muscles finally loosening, though exhaustion threatened to take him down where he stood. "Not yet," he muttered, forcing his legs to move as he closed the distance between them. The men, 3 of them all battered, all looking just as wrecked as he felt, led him into their small circle without hesitation. One of them handed him a canteen, and Frank took it without question, the water sharp and cold against his raw throat. He hadn't realized how dry his mouth was until now, how every breath had been like swallowing dust. "Where's the rest?" he asked after a moment, wiping his mouth with the back of his sleeve. The man who had recognized him, a corporal whose name Frank couldn't quite place, shook his head. "Scattered," he said grimly. "A lot of guys landed off target. Some got picked off before they even hit the ground. The Krauts were waiting for us." Frank nodded. He had already known that, had seen it with his own eyes. The bodies swinging from trees, the parachutes caught in the branches like broken wings. They had walked straight into hell, and hell had been ready for them. The corporal glanced at him, eyes sharp beneath his dirt-streaked helmet. "You see, Charlie?" Frank felt something twist deep in his gut, a sharp, ugly thing that made his grip tighten around a canteen. He didn't answer right away, just stared down at the mud, at the blood drying in dark patches on his sleeves. "He didn't make it," he said finally, the words heavy, final. No one said anything for a long moment. Then the corporal sighed, rubbing a hand over his face before nodding once, as if that single movement could acknowledge the loss, accept it, and bury it all at the same time. "Damn shame," was all he said, but Frank could hear everything else beneath it. They had all lost someone. They didn't have time to mourn. Frank swallowed, his throat tight, and forced himself to push forward, to focus on what came next. "Where are we headed?" he asked, shifting his weight, forcing his exhaustion to the back of his mind. The corporal pointed east, toward the distant glow of flames flickering through the trees. "St. Come-du-Mont. There's a rally point near the outskirts. If we're lucky, we'll find more of our guys there." Lucky? Frank almost laughed at that. But he nodded anyway, adjusting the strap of his rifle, his boots already moving before he could think too much about it. Lucky or not, they had to keep going. There was no other choice. The road to St. Come-du-Mont was a winding, treacherous path through the belly of a war-torn countryside that seemed to swallow them whole the deeper they ventured into it. The night had stretched into an eternity, the sky an endless black void occasionally torn apart by distant flares or the dull thud of artillery somewhere miles away. It was easy to forget that there were thousands of men fighting and dying all around them. Easy to believe that they were the only 4 souls left alive in the world, ghosts moving through a land of the dead. Frank kept his head low, his rifle held close, his ears straining for anything out of place. They moved in near silence, their boots squelching in the mud, breath coming out in controlled exhales, the occasional rustling of gear the only thing betraying their presence. Every step felt like a gamble, every bend in the road another chance to run straight into the enemy. The Germans were out there, had been waiting for them before their boots had even hit the ground, and there was no telling where they'd set up their next ambush. Somewhere to their left, an old farmhouse loomed in the dark, its windows shattered, its roof partially caved in from what must have been a direct hit. The place was quiet, but Frank knew better than to trust the silence. They had all seen what the Germans were capable of. Snipers could be waiting in the rafters, a machine gun nest hidden just inside the doorway. It could be nothing. It could be their deaths. The corporal, still leading the way, slowed his steps, motioning for them to stop. Frank tightened his grip on his rifle, his pulse pounding in his ears. The others crouched low, scanning the shadows, waiting for the corporal to make the call. Minutes stretched into eternity. Then a noise, soft, barely there, but enough. Creak. A footstep. Someone was inside. Frank's stomach twisted into a tight knot. The corporal glanced back at them, his face grim but determined, and motioned toward the house. They had no choice. If Germans were inside, they couldn't risk letting them linger behind their backs. Frank took a breath, steadying himself as they crept forward, each step measured, careful. The porch groaned under their weight, the sound impossibly loud in the quiet. Frank's hands were sweating against the stock of his rifle, his mouth dry as sand. The corporal reached for the door. Then, in the space between heartbeats, everything exploded into chaos. Gunfire erupted from inside the house, shattering the night, sending splinters of wood flying through the air. Frank threw himself sideways, hitting the ground hard as bullets ripped through the doorframe, punching holes in the rotting wood. He heard one of the men curse, heard the corporal shout something he couldn't make out over the deafening noise. Frank rolled onto his stomach, gritted his teeth, and fired. The muzzle flash lit up the darkness for half a second, just long enough to see the shadowed figures inside, their weapons raised, their faces twisted into something like panic. They hadn't expected this. Frank didn't hesitate. He fired again, and again. The others joined in, their rifles cracking through the night, drowning out everything else. The house was filled with the acrid stench of gunpowder, the air thick with dust and smoke. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the gunfire stopped. Silence crashed over them like a wave, thick and suffocating. Frank didn't move at first, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his hands trembling as he gripped his rifle. The corporal pushed himself up, his face streaked with dirt and sweat, his eyes scanning the dark interior of the house. "Clear," he muttered, though his voice was anything but steady. Frank exhaled, forcing his body to move, forcing himself to his feet. His ears were still ringing, his muscles still tight with adrenaline, but he pushed forward, stepping over the threshold, his boots crunching over broken glass and spent shell casings. The Germans were dead. 3 of them, sprawled out across the wooden floor, their uniforms dark with blood, their weapons still clutched in stiffening fingers. One of them couldn't have been older than 18. Frank looked away. "Grab anything useful," the corporal said, his voice gruff, his eyes hard. "We keep moving." They moved through the house quickly, their movements mechanical, efficient. Frank found a Luger tucked into one of the Germans' belts and took it without hesitation, slipping it into his jacket. Another man found a canteen, half full, and passed it around. Minutes later, they were outside again. The house nothing more than another casualty of war, another ruin left to rot in the wake of destruction. Frank glanced back once as they disappeared into the trees. The bodies would still be there in the morning, their blood dried into the floorboards, their weapons abandoned, their faces frozen in the last moments of their lives. War was like that. It didn't care who you were. It didn't care if you were 18 or 40. It didn't care if you had a family waiting for you back home. It took everything and left nothing behind. The march through the countryside was relentless. Every muscle in Frank's body ached, his boots felt like they had fused with his feet, and the weight of his gear pressed down on him like a tombstone. The night was thinning, a sickly gray bleeding into the sky, but the darkness still clung to the world like a stubborn shadow. They needed to find the rest of their unit. Needed to regroup before the Germans closed in around them like a noose. Saint-Commandant was still ahead, somewhere beyond the rolling fields and broken roads, beyond the corpses of gliders torn apart in the hedgerows, beyond the villages that had been chewed up and spat out by war. Frank had always imagined France as something out of a postcard. Rolling hills, vineyards stretching into infinity, small cafes on quiet streets where old men smoked pipes and talked about nothing at all. But this was not the France from the stories. This was a graveyard with no end. They found another group of paratroopers just after dawn, huddled in the ruins of a barn that looked like it had been standing since before America was even a country. A lieutenant, his uniform streaked with dirt and blood, took charge of them without question, barely glancing up as they joined his makeshift command post. He was poring over a crude map, his finger tracing lines that meant nothing to Frank. All he knew was that they were still too far from their objective, and every second they wasted here was another second the Germans had to fortify their positions. Someone passed Frank a ration, and he tore into it without hesitation, shoving the dried, tasteless biscuit into his mouth, barely chewing before swallowing. Hunger was a dull ache in his gut, something he had long since learned to ignore. The lieutenant lifted his head, his eyes sharp despite the exhaustion weighing on his face. "We move in 10 minutes, he said, his voice low but firm. "There's a machine gun nest near the main road. We take it out, we push forward." No hesitation. No mistakes. Frank nodded, wiping his mouth with the back of his sleeve. He didn't need a speech. Didn't need promises of glory or victory. He just needed to keep moving. Keep surviving. The march resumed, this time with purpose. They moved in a staggered formation, rifles raised, eyes scanning the fields and the tree lines, expecting an ambush at every turn. The land around them was alive with the sounds of war, distant explosions, the rapid chatter of machine guns, the occasional scream that was quickly swallowed by the wind. The machine gun nest was exactly where the lieutenant said it would be. A small outpost dug into the hillside, camouflaged with branches and debris, but unmistakably deadly. Frank could see the glint of the barrel through the foliage, the telltale sign of sandbags stacked high to absorb incoming fire. There was no time for hesitation. The lieutenant gave the signal, and the world erupted into chaos. Frank hit the ground, pressing himself into the dirt as bullets tore through the air above him, splintering branches, kicking up clouds of dust and debris. He could hear shouting, both English and German, voices lost in the roar of gunfire. Someone was screaming, a horrible, wet sound that made Frank's stomach lurch, but he didn't stop. Couldn't stop. He pushed forward, crawling through the mud, his rifle gripped tight, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. The machine gun chattered again, and a body fell beside him, lifeless before it hit the ground. He didn't look. Didn't have time. Then an opening. A grenade. He pulled the pin, counted 1, 2, then hurled it with everything he had. The explosion was deafening. Smoke and fire swallowed the nest, and for a brief, terrible moment, there was nothing but silence. Then the shouting resumed, but this time it was different. The Germans were panicking, running. Frank didn't think. He just moved. The next few moments were a blur of movement and gunfire, of bodies collapsing in the dirt, of shouts and curses, and the sickening crunch of boots on bones. And then, suddenly, it was over. The nest was theirs. Saint-Come-du-Mont was still ahead. And the war wasn't done with them yet. The sun clawed its way up the horizon, bleeding through the morning fog like a wound that refused to close. Frank wiped the sweat from his face with the back of his sleeve. Though it was useless, his uniform was soaked. The grime of the last 12 hours caked onto his skin like a second layer of flesh. They had taken the machine gun nest, secured a brief foothold on the road leading to Saint-Come-du-Mont. But victory was a cruel, fleeting thing. The Germans were regrouping. Even now, the distant rumble of approaching tanks sent a shudder through the earth beneath his boots. They were coming, and Frank had no illusions about what that meant. The lieutenant ordered them into defensive positions, using the remains of a crumbling stone wall for cover. There were barely more than a dozen of them left, ragged and battle-worn, their ammunition running low. Some still clung to the reckless bravado that had driven them from the sky the night before, but Frank could see the truth in their eyes. This wasn't going to hold. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and the reinforcements they so desperately needed were still too far away. He glanced at Carter, the youngest among them, barely 19, his fingers twitching against the trigger of his rifle. He looked like a kid who had just realized the world wasn't fair, that no one was coming to save him. Frank wanted to say something, anything, but what was there to say? That it would be okay. That they would all make it home. The lie caught in his throat, choking him. The first artillery shell screamed overhead, slamming into the dirt 100 yards away, sending a cloud of smoke and debris into the sky. Then another. Closer this time. They braced themselves. And then hell arrived. The first wave of Germans came fast, storming down the road with the ruthless efficiency Frank had come to expect. The air filled with gunfire, the sharp cracking sound of rifles, the deep, rattling roar of machine guns. The stone wall shuddered as bullets chewed through it, sending shards of rock and dust raining down over them. Frank fired blindly into the chaos, his body moving on instinct alone. There was no time to think, no time to process the madness unfolding around him. Men were falling, screaming, their bodies jerking like marionettes before collapsing into the mud. The stench of blood and gunpowder thickened in the air, clawing at his throat. Carter was hit first. The bullet took him in the chest, knocking him back against the wall. His mouth opened in shock, but no sound came out, only a ragged gasp as his body slid to the ground. Frank barely had time to register it before another explosion rocked the earth, sending him sprawling. His helmet flew off, his ears ringing, his vision blurring as pain shot through his skull. He struggled to push himself up, his fingers grasping for his rifle, but the battle was already slipping away from them. The lieutenant was dead, his body crumpled in the dirt, his eyes staring at nothing. The others, scattered, broken, lost in the chaos. The Germans were pushing forward, relentless, unstoppable. Frank knew what came next. Surrender or die. His heart pounded in his chest, a desperate, primal thing. He thought of home, of the small town he had left behind, of the girl who had promised to wait for him, of the life he had dreamed of returning to. It felt so far away now, like a dream slipping through his fingers. A shadow fell over him. He looked up, dazed, his vision swimming. A German soldier stood above him, rifle raised, eyes cold and unreadable. This was it. But then something changed. The German hesitated. For the briefest moment, their eyes met, and Frank saw something there, something human. The war had stripped them all down to nothing but survival, but in that single frozen second, he saw something else. Recognition. Understanding. The soldier lowered his rifle. Frank didn't move. Couldn't. He just lay there, breath shallow, waiting for the shot that never came. And then the German turned and walked away. The battle raged on around him, but for Frank, time had stopped. He would never know why, but he was still alive. And that, in the end, was the cruelest part of all.